Hi folks, my name is Mike Dobbs and this is another edition of Government Matters. Today on the program we have one of the three declared candidates for the Democratic Party nomination for governor. And I know you're saying, well, that's not until next year, but as politics has shown, it always is helpful to get a head start, especially in terms of name recognition, campaign platforms, and of course fundraising. Our guest today is Ben Downing. Mr. Downing is a former state senator. He hails from Pittsfield, which is great, even though he lives in the Boston area, which is not so great, but we'll forgive him that. Ben, thanks very much for coming on board here.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike. I appreciate it, really do.
Well, you and I have talked a couple times, but these folks may not know you, so I want to lead off with the standard question of who are you and why are you running for governor?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a former senator from Western Mass, a clean energy business leader, dad to two toddler boys, Malcolm and Eamon. I'm the husband of Michaela and her adventure partner, the oldest of Jerry and Pam's 4 kids. And these days we make our family and our home in East Boston. But I grew up in Pittsfield, spent the first 20 plus years of my life there, and then after college and a few years working in Washington, D.C. for Congressman Neal and Congressman Olver, I came home to go to grad school, and a state Senate seat opened up, and I had been taught from an early age that we were incredibly lucky, that we were middle class and lucky to be, and that we had a responsibility to give back to our community and to make sure that more folks in that community had the opportunities that we got. I grew up at a time where Pittsfield was dealing with the fallout from GE leaving us to rebuild and clean up and figure out what our city was going to look like. And what my generation heard was study hard and get out. And I think unfortunately that sounds familiar to folks in Springfield and Holyoke and in New Bedford, Fall River, and plenty other communities. And I wanted to be a part of changing that story, to make sure that every kid in Pittsfield, that every kid in each and every one of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts had the same opportunities that I got. And so I was lucky enough to run for the state Senate in 2006, won by the landslide margin of 243 votes, spent 5 terms in the state Senate, working on issues around climate and clean energy, poverty, hunger, transgender equal rights, gateway city economic development and revitalization, ethics reform, and other issues. I term limited myself. I had made a promise in that first election that I'd only serve 5 terms if I was lucky enough to get them. I did that, and then spent the last 4 years working in the clean energy industry, building solar and battery storage projects from Maine to Hawaii.
Wow. In terms of the conversations that we've had so far, so much of what you talk about is centered around climate change, clean energy, and the economic development that comes from addressing those issues. And I know that you just released a statement, sort of a plan about the types of things that you would tackle, and most importantly, how you would pay for them. So if I remember correctly, a lot of what you're talking about in this most recent press release you sent out involved transportation issues. So let's talk a moment or two about that. Clearly, you want to go as green as possible when it comes to mass transit. For those of us in Western Massachusetts, this has been an issue that Senator Lesser has been bringing up with East-West Rail. So I'll put you on the spot. Do you support the idea of East-West passenger rail?
Yes, I do. And in that plan, we commit to building the line by 2030. So I think we need to set aggressive goals at the State House and in state government if we're going to see the progress that we need in Western Massachusetts in particular. We know that too often we hear politicians and political leaders make promises, and the delivery on those promises is delayed if it ever comes at all. I know from having grown up in Western Mass, having lived in Western Massachusetts, that if the priorities of Western Massachusetts and gateway cities aren't central in the mind of our leaders, then our needs will not be met. A one-size-fits-all solution for Massachusetts doesn't address the unique needs, challenges, and opportunities of Springfield, of Holyoke, of Chicopee, of Pittsfield, of North Adams. So that's why I've committed to East-West Rail and building that by 2030. It's critically important for economic development in Western and Central Mass. It's critically important for climate. We need to get people out of cars and using buses and trains wherever possible. But for us to say that, we need to give people the opportunity to do it and make sure it's reliable and affordable for everyone.
Let's talk about a few other of those things that was in that press release in terms of transportation. And also, can you talk a little bit about how you would propose paying for all this?
Yeah, so a couple of the other proposals. First we would propose fare-free transit. The way that our transit systems, the PVTA, the BRTA in the Berkshires, the MBTA in Boston, operate now is their revenue streams are a mix of support from the federal government, the state government, and then fares from riders. Well, that business model, in particular relying on fares from riders, that's based on when we had streetcars and trolleys from the late 1800s. Well, if we operated every business like we did in the late 1800s, we'd be in a far different place. We need to change the business model of our regional transit authorities, and we need to invest in transit and transportation like the public good that it is. So the idea would be that we would fund the operations of the PVTA and of the other surrounding regional transit authorities out of taxes and get away from relying on fares. Why is that important? We've seen in every pilot program where either a line or a whole agency has gone fare-free, their ridership goes up, the benefits flow directly to those who have been hardest hit by the COVID-19 recession, and quite frankly, go directly to communities that have seen the least wage growth and the least economic opportunity for my lifetime, for the last 40 plus years. That's one of those priorities. We would also double funding for the regional transit authorities to make that possible. How do you fund it? You fund it through the Fair Share Amendment. You fund it through regional transportation commissions and regional ballot initiatives. One of the reasons I believe that we are in the same position today that we were 20 years or 30 years ago when it comes to transportation in Massachusetts, if not worse, right? Crumbling infrastructure, unreliable transit, is that we have landed in a status quo where every region of the state is convinced that someone else is benefiting from the current setup, when the truth is that every region of the state is being held back by our current transportation system. What's been missing and what could unlock that potential is empowering regions to control their own future. In almost every other part of the country, a regional mechanism, whether it's county government or a regional transportation commission, puts a plan to the voters every 3 years, every 5 years for how to fund their transportation needs. That's what we need in Massachusetts to serve as another sort of leg on the funding stool for transportation.
Now, right now, let's just look a little bit at the RTAs, Regional Transportation Authorities. The PVTA is the largest one in the state outside the MBTA. Yeah. Every other RTA does not get forward funding. Yeah. Basically, and folks may not really realize this, in essence, they run a fiscal year and then they get the money back from the state. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's a real problem with that. There's a real problem in how you plan your business and whether or not the funding that you're going to get at the end of the year is really going to be the amount of funding that you need. On top of that, I know that with the PVTA, they've had to cut lines. They've had to cut routes and schedules. And the problem with that is that when you start cutting the availability of mass transit, your ridership goes down because now there's fewer opportunities.
It's a vicious cycle
for them to do. So when you take that, if they cut stuff in order to try to second guess the funding, now we're in this slow but surely downward spiral when it comes to public transit. Yeah. And this has been talked about for years, and for whatever reason, there hasn't been a Democrat or Republican governor or a legislative body that will address this. And it's extremely frustrating to all of us. Yeah. And the other thing I'll just add, you can tell I've done some stories about this, is the MBTA is the only one of the RTAs that has a guaranteed funding source through the sales tax. Yeah. And I understand it is serving 90% or so of the state's population. But that also puts the other RTAs,
Yeah.
like in the Berkshires and here and in Franklin County, at a really distinctive risk.
Mm-hmm.
Would you try to fix that if you're governor?
Yes, we would have a guaranteed revenue stream for the RTAs. We would also have increased funding for the RTAs as well. Critically important across the board that they are better able to plan for their future so that they can stop being in sort of this defensive austerity position where they're trying to figure out how do we preserve service to best meet the needs of our population, instead of saying, how do we add more service? How do we bring on more riders? How do we encourage more people to use our service? And how do we become more of a vital lifeline to the entire region that we are ultimately serving? And that may well be more flexible service. That might be less buses as we transition to a fully electric fleet, and more vans and more sort of broader distributed services, less dedicated lines, more on-call service. It's going to be a mix of things, but we know that mix is going to be different from one region to the next. They all need reliability. They all need predictability. They all need a dedicated funding stream across the board for all of the RTAs. The answers are going to be different. They need the flexibility of regional autonomy and control to be able to plan and supplement what the state and federal government are going to do as well. And this is not theoretical to me, Mike. I've been out riding on transit lines as a part of our Transportation for All rollout. I regularly ride the MBTA, but try to ride as many transit lines as I can as we're in this campaign. But I was riding the 28 bus on the MBTA. I rode the 24 bus and the 11 bus at the Worcester Regional Transit Authority, part of their fare-free pilot program. I rode the B7 bus here today up Boston State Road from Union Station straight out to Eastfield Mall. And you saw folks who had that transit line as a lifeline. It was bringing them to school. It was bringing them to the grocery store. It was bringing them to get a COVID test. And hey, by the way, if you're worried about if you're COVID positive and you're on the bus that long to get way out there, maybe it's a reminder that we're not doing enough when it comes to COVID testing, and they should be more regularly accessible. But it is a reminder of the lifeline that transportation is in its current state, and how much more could be done if we actually have the support that it ought to have.
This would also build jobs, what
Yes.
you're talking about. So we're talking about something that not only would improve a 21st century infrastructure, but it would also provide people with jobs and careers.
Absolutely. We're talking about climate action, and we're talking about jobs. Well, investing in transit is climate action that's going to create jobs. It's jobs for the bus drivers. It's jobs for the mechanics. We drove by the PVTA headquarters today. Beautiful as it is, there is a help wanted sign out front, and they need people to apply. Those are good careers, good union jobs that are going to be able to help someone earn a living wage, put a roof over their head, be able to pay the bills, and be able to have that secure middle-class life that so many folks strive for and long for at this point. So yes, it's good for the climate, it's good for the environment, and it's also a matter of racial justice as well. We know that the ridership of our RTAs is significantly more diverse than the state population as a whole. And if we're serious about addressing the racial wealth and wage gaps in this state, then we need to make investments in transit a priority for the next administration, and they will be for me.
So you talked a little bit about using some of the federal money that is coming out of the COVID relief acts. This of course is a huge hot button issue right now. I think there's some people who are looking to use some of these funds for some short-term stuff. You're talking about some long-term stuff, because clearly to turn around our transportation infrastructure like this, it's going to take a while to do all this. Do you feel that whoever is going to be the next governor will have access to enough federal funds to make this work, or is this still in question in your mind?
I think the federal funds are a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make the long-term investments that we need to make in the physical and human infrastructure. If we talk about the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the reconciliation package that's spread out over 10 years, and then the earlier package, the earlier stabilization and recovery package. If you look at those three, it's an opportunity to make those long-term investments. I do think that it will still need the fair share amendment or other state-based revenue to support the ongoing operation and maintenance of that system. We're very good in Massachusetts at doing the new thing. We aren't very good at maintaining and operating the core infrastructure and services that we have. And I think that frustrates people to no end. That's incumbent on leaders to make sure that we're doing that as well. So I have proposed that 80% of the state resources that are coming back from the federal stimulus go directly towards climate solutions, whether that's transit, whether that's affordable housing built near transit that is energy efficient, whether that's deployment of renewables across the state. We need to be putting everything we can towards an expedited, urgent, and fair and just transition to deal with climate change.
I think that one thing that governors in the near future are going to have to deal with, speaking of climate change, is now, of course, our hurricane season. You know, we've already experienced some of this. We're probably going to experience more of this. Granted, there isn't a Massachusetts governor that can do something about hurricanes, but what is being brought out of this is the fragility of our energy system, the fact that any time that one of these weather events takes place, it can result in millions, if not billions of dollars in terms of damage. Looking forward, do you see that the types of things that you're proposing would be a positive benefit, our contribution to trying to address what is happening with us with climate?
So yes, but they're just part of it, Mike. And I think one of the proposals within the climate plan that my campaign released, the first policy plan that we rolled out, is to create effectively a super secretariat position above the cabinet level officers in a Downing administration who will coordinate climate efforts across all the secretaries to make sure that it's not just the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs job to coordinate our climate response, but rather the Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, the Secretary of Labor and Workforce Development, the Secretary of Education, Health and Human Services, all need to be thinking about climate as a part of their mission. And that's when we're making grants. It's also in our daily operating, so that when the state makes an award for an infrastructure grant, climate is a component of that and needs to be thought of in that respect. When we're making upgrades, whether it's to the blue line that runs under Boston Harbor or when we're building East-West Rail, we have to be thinking about climate, about the changing weather patterns, the changing flooding patterns, to make sure that we get the best bang for the buck in the use of those. So it's both mitigating the impacts of climate with smart planning in the short term, expediting our transition to clean energy and limiting our impact on future climate change, and then making sure we're capturing the benefit of all of those actions taken together. But we aren't going to get there simply by saying, yeah, that's the job of the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs over there. No, it has to be a core driving part of the work of every aspect of state government, a true whole of government approach. That's what I'm proposing in my policy plan.
Now, the State House News Service reported that part of the way you would fund these things is to increase taxes. So let's talk about the dirtiest thing that we can talk about in politics, which is increasing taxes in Massachusetts. People still perceive, they still call us Taxachusetts, that this is a very expensive place to live. Is what you're proposing going to truly affect the average middle class person or the working poor person?
No, it's not going to. What it's going to do is it's going to ask more of those who have benefited the most from economic growth, from wage growth over the course of the last 30 years, the last 40 years, but even during the pandemic. We've seen the wealth and the wages of those at the upper end of the economic spectrum continue to rise, and the gap between them and the middle class, the gap between them and the poor, grow wider and wider. I think it is only fair for Massachusetts as a whole to ask more of those who have benefited significantly from economic growth over that time period to invest back in this state to make sure that more people have access to opportunity. My preference would be that we do that through the Fair Share Amendment. My preference would be that we do that by empowering regions to come up with their regional plans and a regional assessment to help meet those plans. But I think we need to keep all options on the table so that we can fund the investments that we need to make, and where we have kicked the can down the road for my entire lifetime, right? We have kicked the can down the road and led to the next generation of problem. That's going to stop in a Downing administration.
One of the things that I know that people have been talking about is, of course, the economic impact of climate change, in terms of suddenly there are certain things that climate change may not let us do. For instance, we have a real crisis in California. California is one of the largest food producing areas in the nation, and they're undergoing this mega drought. They say it's like a drought that happens every 1,000 years. Our food supply may be affected by that. The cost of food may be affected by that. There was just a report, I believe the National Geographic had it, about lobsters here in New England, and about how the increase in temperature in the ocean water could affect lobstering. So on one hand, we have our local economy with a healthy group of people who are doing fishing. On the other hand, we're looking across the country, but it's clear that climate change could affect not only jobs, but it could affect things like our food chain, where our foods are coming from. Do you think that enough people are thinking about sort of that long-term what if? I mean, I can't imagine Massachusetts without a fishing industry, but we don't know how it's really going to be affected, for instance. And so in the future, there may be some real economic and job challenges that come out of this.
So I think there's a lot of talk, Mike. I think there's a lot of thinking. I don't think there's enough action on these points. And I think the point that you bring up around our food supply, I think is true broadly of our economy. One of sort of the sort of clear trends that I think we need to begin towards, if we haven't already, is building more resilient regional economies. We need to make sure that we are less dependent on outside of New England, outside of Massachusetts, outside of Western Mass, right, as much as possible for all that we need. And I think that is, that is a healthy trend on the whole. It makes us more resilient. It might not be more textbook economically efficient, but there is a resilience of making sure that we are able to meet our local needs here locally, and that's going to create economic opportunity. It's going to allow us to weather some of the storms that unfortunately we're going to deal with no matter what, because of the steps that haven't been taken for the last generation on climate change. I think that's just as true of our electric grid, right? We've seen in Texas and in other states, in other regions, what happens when you rely on an electric system that's just built around 5 or 6 big energy producers, instead of an electric grid and system that's built around thousands of energy producers from every roof, from every brownfield, from every parking lot, from every wind turbine, from every battery across the state. That is far more resilient in the long term, and it's going to limit the long-term impacts of climate as well.
Okay, so let's do a little lightning round here. Now, Steve, do you have a jackhammer? Because right behind that wall, folks, is the brand new but practically deserted MGM Sports Book. They've got an incredible TV set operation there. It's got 16 different screens in it. They've got 75 seats. They've got a bar. It's very plush. It's very nice. It's a great place to sit and meditate at this point, because we don't have a sports book. So I know you and I have talked a little bit about this. Naturally, there are people with the Gaming Commission who are trying to make predictions about how much revenue would flow out of sports gaming. Of course, those predictions vary depending upon which scenario you use in terms of what is going to be sports gaming. Do you? And I know that you're not particularly in favor of all this, but do you see this as a revenue tool that could be used for some of the various programs that you're talking about?
It's a revenue tool that could be used. While I don't have a firm opinion yet on sports gambling generally, I do believe, and this is in line with our last conversation, that it shouldn't be solely captured. The benefit of that should not solely be captured by the casinos, by the existing gambling sites, that there ought to be a broadly shared access to that to some degree, in particular to address issues around equity and some of those gaps in our society that we've brought up. But absolutely, it could be a revenue stream that could help us fund some of those.
The other thing that has just been reported, and I'm sure that you saw it, the Cannabis Control Commission, I'm hitting all the major vices here, sports book and smoking grass. The Cannabis Control Commission talked about how much money has come in through recreational cannabis sales. It's pretty astonishing. It's millions and millions and millions of dollars. And the figure that they reported, which unfortunately I can't remember off the top of my head, was year to date. We haven't even gotten the rest of the year in. Again, this is now being viewed by municipal leaders as well on the state level as sort of like found money. In no way did we anticipate just exactly what this would be like. Again, for someone who wants to be governor, when you take a look at this revenue stream, do you see possibilities of growth? Do you fear that this might be, first year success that might slowly but surely level out someplace as we get more dispensaries? What's your opinion on that?
So I think we will probably see continued growth, probably not at the levels that we have seen to date. I think in particular, some of the revenue numbers coming out of the Western Mass sites, in particular the Berkshire County sites, are going to be impacted by future legalization in New York and them standing up the industry as well. But I think we can assume that there will be regular growth in the revenues from the industry. I think the revenues that the state takes in ought to go towards criminal justice efforts. They ought to go towards supporting some of our addiction and recovery programs, which we've had scattered access to in Western Mass in particular, but in other areas as well. And I think it's exciting to see, and I think we've got to make sure that we continue to work on addressing equity concerns around the ownership and operation of these facilities that too often are just national companies, and we don't see enough of the benefits stay here locally.
Okay, so I need to ask you the question that my boss just wanted me to ask you, and we can.
Was it where I get my hair done? Because I get that one all the time, Mike. So.
And that is, you spoke at the beginning when you were talking about your background about being taught about public service, and we do like to ask candidates and elected officials what led them to pursue this, because certainly the life of an elected official is not only an opportunity to do good for your community or for your state. So again, I just want to probe this a little bit more. Did you have like a political family? Did your mother and father talk about politics, talk about issues around the dinner table?
Yeah, so we grew up in a family where we talked a lot about the issues of the day. My dad ran for district attorney when I was 9 years old. He was district attorney of Berkshire County for 13 years before he passed away. And I think the thing that stuck with me the most, beyond the community rallying around my family and holding us up when my father passed, was not the stories of the trials he was involved in, not the headline stories, but folks who came to the wake and the funeral and talked about how my dad helped get them into recovery services, how my dad helped them deal with a labor and employment issue, with a housing law issue, deal with those day-to-day things that aren't the headline grabbers, but help directly impact and improve someone's life. And that stuck with me. I didn't know that elective office would be what I pursued. I did know that I wanted to be part of trying to serve my community and give back to my community. And I would say, if there's young folks thinking about this, don't think you got to have it figured out by the beginning, right? Like I thought I was going to go to law school. I didn't get into the law schools I wanted to go to. And that ends up opening up this opportunity for me to go to work for Congressman Neal and Congressman Olver. And I fell in love with public service in that form at that time. So for young people who are thinking about it, don't think you got to have it all figured out at the beginning.
Excellent. Thank you very much for coming in today. And I'm sure we'll be seeing you again over the campaign trail. We've got a lot of months yet to go here. Yeah. But as always, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike, and looking forward to meeting folks out on the campaign trail.
And thank you very much for tuning in to another edition of Government Matters.